What's up, what's up, what's up? Hey there, followers of the Messiah. Welcome. As we're counting down the month of December, one of the things that's come across my calendar, and I'm pretty confident it's come across yours, is everybody is doing their shopping for this event called Christmas. There's so much that I wanted to say on this, but gosh, I don't want to bury you guys. So for me, it's been a discovery and an epiphany over the last 4 years. And it's one of those things where once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So be warned, you're going to see Christmas in a whole new light. And you're going to have to realize that Christmas is not in the Bible. So let's take a look. So what I'm talking about here is we're entering another decade. It was only 4 years ago I came to knowledge that neither Easter nor Christmas are in the Bible. I dug a bit deeper only to find that Christmas is man's traditions and nowhere called for as a celebration in Scripture. Instead, we find 7 feasts in Leviticus 23 that are perpetual. That goes on until all things are fulfilled. And remember, we have 1/3 of prophecy yet to be fulfilled with the return of the Messiah, the judgment of the nations, the millennial reign, and all the rest of the new heaven and the new earth. So anyone that says we don't have to keep the instructions in the first 5 books of the Bible hasn't read the Bible, because it says flat out, none of this goes away. It's perpetual until all things are fulfilled. Although we read the story of how Joseph and Mary entered Bethlehem for the census, nowhere do we have a teaching that says we're to memorialize it. If you study the Scripture, you're going to find that the shepherds were still in the fields. If you know anything about Israel in that region of the earth, you know December, no one is in the fields. Roll back 3 or 4 months and there you go. This actually coincides with the fall feasts, including Sukkot, which is tabernacles in Hebrew. And we read several references in the New Testament where we are told he came to dwell or tabernacle with us in human form. This lines up exactly with the Feast of Tabernacles being his birth or the time of his birth on earth. Something to note additionally by this time, that the wise men bearing gifts, when they showed up, Yahushua, that's Jesus to those of you that follow the 15th century name, it's not his given name, was already 3 years old. So keep that in mind. By Christmas morning, he was already 3 and had never heard the name Jesus. So that's important to note. So what are we going to do with Christmas if it's not in Scripture? It's actually mentioned as a pagan practice or a celebration in Jeremiah, and it talks about decorating the trees like the pagans. You can read this in Jeremiah 10, verses 1 through 10. It originally came as a tribute to Nimrod, and you can read about him in Genesis chapter 10, verse 8, and there's quite a bit more in the book of Enoch and other books. He was the first leader and the ruler to strive against God and to orchestrate the building of the Tower of Babel. He was the opposite of our Messiah, the anti-Messiah. He was the first prototype of the man of sin to be here in the last days, a man of power and deception. So if you look at Nimrod's birthday, funny enough, December 25th, right after winter solstice. Nimrod was deified in ancient Nineveh, so this is actually there. We have Nimrod, and compare the difference. Holding a tree, holding reindeer, all of this is there. So this is nothing new, folks. This has been around since ancient Babylon. And as many of you already know, today's day is all about this guy, Nimrod, from ancient Babylon. He was a twisted, evil king who started civilizations. After he died, his mother and baby mother, yes, he had a child with his mother. His mother, Semiramis, claimed that a Christmas tree, a pine tree, arose from his grave. She claimed the spirit of Nimrod visited the evergreen tree to place gifts on it. Pagan ways, Nimrod, and this is all about Saturnalia. So you can research Saturnalia, but the Nimrod tree, on each anniversary of his birth, December 25th, Nimrod would visit the evergreen tree and leave gifts, and you can read about that in The Plain Truth About Christmas by David J. Stewart, written 16 years ago. One of Noah's great-grandsons, and this is memorialized in Genesis chapter 10, was called Nimrod. Nimrod was a tyrant. He was the first empire builder. He built Babel. He built Nineveh. You can read about Nineveh and the judgment of Nineveh in the book of Jonah. He was the ruler of the then known world. His wife, history says, was named Semiramis, and she was a very great queen. Satan, the deceiver, was working to counterfeit Yahuwah's plan of deliverance. After Nimrod's death, the people said he was a mighty one. Semiramis told them that he was indeed the sun god, and this is where sun worship began. That is, his spirit was still living, dwelling in the sun. December 25th is his birthday. It's not the birthday of the Messiah. The Messiah was born in September. So, other names for Nimrod: Moloch, Zeus, Apollo, Inti, Krishna, and you can look all this up. There's references here with TorahZone.net. They're a good resource. Some other things to keep in mind. Can you believe that Christians will actually invite the Norse pagan god Odin into their churches and sit children on his lap in much the same way that the ancient Israelites did with the Canaanite pagan god Molech? You believe that? It's exactly the same. Now, what I'm about to share with you is absolutely incredible, and in a lot of ways it's disgusting. You can read part of it in Jeremiah 10, but this is true. The pagan origins of the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree is an Asherah, a sexual object with hidden symbols of male fertility. When we read about this, and I'll go through it in a second, the truth is what matters. So Galatians 4:16, while the first settlers of this nation were believers and followers of the Messiah, they did not observe Christmas. It was outlawed in all 13 colonies because it was based on paganism. The tree is interpreted originally by the occult as a phallus, the ornaments as testicles, and the tinsel as semen. The wreath is a vagina, and together they are fertility symbols. This is documented fact. So again, what you are doing has nothing to do with the Messiah. Even though you may justify it by saying, in my mind, that's what I want, that's what I'm doing. And I've got a word for you about that in just a minute. So when we talk about modern pagan Christianity, again, early English and American societies observed God's seventh-day Sabbath, that's Saturday, and his 7 annual holy days, which we'll look at in a minute. Their governments enacted laws against keeping Christmas, which they regarded as an ancient pagan holiday. There's a number of scriptures here you can reference about this and where it came from. It's important that we focus as one nation under God if we really are that. If you want to learn about the pagan roots of our country, because it really is shocking. I read this several years ago. It's called Babylon Rising by Rob Skiba. That's spelled S-K-I-B-A, Babylon Rising. And it's The First Shall Be Last. And it talks about Nimrod as the prototype for the man of sin that is coming, the one everybody refers to as the Antichrist. Nimrod was the first model of that. And if you want to read about it, as well as how our country was founded, not in Christian roots, not in biblical roots, but actually there's a lot of paganism and symbiology in DC that he points out and has pictures and illustrations of. So I would highly recommend you get a copy of that. And I'll put that as a link at the bottom of the article here. So here's the thing. You say you want to do it because you're worshiping and God knows your heart. Here's the problem. Can you spot the difference between these two? Yahweh, your Elohim, will cut off before you the nations you are about to invade and dispossess. But when you have driven them out and settled in their land after they have been destroyed before you, be careful not to be ensnared by inquiring about their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? We will do the same. You must not worship Yahweh, your Elohim, in the way, their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things Yahweh hates. So, Deuteronomy 12, verses 29 through 31. It's there for your reference. Folks, God doesn't see a difference. So, if you want to worship in your own way, or worship in a way that's different than what he calls you to do, bear in mind that's not obedience. And I would not wish that upon anybody. So let's talk a little bit about what we are supposed to do. So what do? There are 7 feasts outlined in the book of Leviticus. That's in chapter 23. The instructions were given to the priests of Yahovah, and those are our appointed times, our moedim. That's Hebrew for appointed times. So those are the times to celebrate and be with our Father in addition to our weekly Sabbath, which is set aside to worship, study, and enjoy time with him and our families. We look at the feasts and we see there are none in this time period. So we should have nothing to do with the pagan worship and await our spring feast, the first one being Passover. This was hard for me when I discovered this because I had just spent the year before a ridiculous amount on my grandkids, and this next year was a year of obedience. I explained it to my son, their dad, and he, being Orthodox, didn't understand nor really have any reasoning behind it, but he accepted it. It has been difficult as the rest of the world does this, but the narrow path is indeed hard. So study this and go through the chapter Leviticus 23 and learn about this. The 7 feasts, Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, those have all been symbolically fulfilled in the Messiah's death, burial, and resurrection, and then his presentation of everything and the outpouring of the Spirit. We're waiting on the last 3. Remember, he said, Matthew chapter 5, verses 16 through 19, none of the Torah, the instructions, goes away until all things are fulfilled. We're waiting on the last 3. Feast of Trumpets, that's when Messiah's rebirth of the bride and his return will be. The atonement, that's the Messiah's beginning of his mystery and restoration of Israel, but is also the day of judgment and fulfillment. And then ultimately, he dwells with mankind in tabernacles and returns for his second coming, the millennium. So it's important to understand that the scriptures tell us the end from the very beginning, and the feasts are not only constant reminders, hence that's why they're listed as perpetual and say so in the scriptures, but they are prototypes of an actual event that we're going to experience. With that in mind, we are to be all the more careful in observing them instead of the world's feasts, celebrations, and events. Yes, even New Year's celebrates Janus, a pagan two-faced god. Look it up. So the feasts are not just a timeline of his first and second coming, but these are things including the day of the Lord, the rising from the dead, and the kingdom of heaven. So all of that is explained here. I would highly encourage you to spend some time studying the feast and then ask him to guide you with his Spirit so that you might understand in a more complete way. Most importantly, we want to be focused on being obedient. Remember, it's not the ones that are observing the law of Moses or Moshe in Hebrew that are disposed of. It's those that are found not following his words that are separated and discarded. Read his words. More than once, he gave illustrations of the harvest and the destruction of the goats, the tares, etc. What's interesting is these people all claim to be doing his work in his name, yet he never knew them because they didn't love him enough to keep his words. So the Bible doesn't say, "Depart from me, you who practice the law." It says those that practice lawlessness. And the section of the Gospels, Matthew chapter 7, verse 23, that whole parable is right there. And it is a foretelling of what's coming. So be prepared. So I know this is a tough time for this type of insight, but we're all called to walk with him. Some will, most won't. Where will you be found? I love you all. I wish you all the best. Consider where you are and consider what your walk is. Obedience is what it's all about. Shalom.